Welcome back to This Is How We Create. My name is Martine Severin. I'm your host, and today we are going to be talking about recording nearly 200 episodes, 200 episodes of the podcast, and what that has taught me about wisdom. So, there is a book, Ryan Holiday's Discipline is Destiny, which sits on my bedside table like a quiet accusation. I picked this book up during one of the seasons where everything felt super impossible. And it was like the kind of impossible where you convince that yourself that your struggles are really unique, that your struggles are unprecedented, and surely no one in the world was going through or had ever been going through the things that you were facing. This episode is brought to you by iCode. Every child starts as a creator. They imagine stories, build worlds, and ask big questions. But as they grow up, creativity can take a backseat to routine and screens. That's where iCode comes in. Through after-school STEM activities, iCode's programs give kids a space to create again. Visit icodeschool.com to book a free trial. I was just having, the specific changes that was happening in my life didn't have to do with algorithms or podcasts or downloads, but they had to do with the fundamentals, fear, doubt, and the gap between who we are and who we really want to be. And I think that's been there all along. So Ryan's book became my perfect bedside companion. I read it in at night and in the morning because it did something I desperately needed. It took away so many excuses, not in a cruel or dismissive way, but it just helped me understand that my struggles about procrastination, about wondering if the work I did was mattered, and essentially it helped me get over myself. And that's what really drew me to Stoicism in the first place. Not necessarily the philosophy itself, but the humbling realization that humans have been wrestling with these questions. They've been doing the things that are difficult and they've been doing it for a very, very long time. So we've been wondering if our work is not good enough, if our work matters, if we'll ever figure it out. And turns out that we're just the latest in a long line of people who've been wondering the same thing. So, what exactly have I learned through the 200 podcast episodes that I've done, and what wisdom have I gotten through it? Well, this wisdom is practical. It's it's wisdom that's been tested under fire, that's been adjusted. The Stoics knew it, and my guests knew it. And now, slowly, I am learning all of this wisdom too. My favorite podcast is Hidden Brain, and Hidden Brain talks about essentially neuroscience and how that affects all the decisions that we make, how neuroscience and the way that we view the world, our brains, how all that affects our how we perceive the world. So there's this Hidden Brain episode where a philosopher named Massimo, and I'm going to butcher this, Massimo Pigliucci, describes breaking down on the side of a highway. Now, things were not going well for Massimo. His father had just died and he hadn't had a chance to say goodbye. And he couldn't get on a plane to go there early enough. His marriage was ending. He was moving across the country to a new job, to a new city, and he wasn't sure what was going to happen with his life. So if you picture this, he's sitting there sobbing in his rental car. All of these cars are passing by him as he is on the highway. And years before, Massimo had learned about Stoicism. And in Stoicism, he always had thought that it was too cold, too rigid. And he thought, who wants to kind of live like that? And so he thought about Marcus Aurelius. And so he thought about a line from Marcus's book. And this line says, "The cucumber is bitter, don't eat it. Why do you have to go on and complain about the fact that there are bitter cucumbers in the world?" And so this line stuck with me. And that's essentially, I know this is a long way of going about it, but that's essentially what nearly 200 episode of this podcast has taught me about wisdom. And it doesn't like it's taught me things that doesn't sound really beautiful in quotes or in a graphic quote, but it's taught me the kind of things when everything's on fire and you don't know which way to turn or to run. You think you need some inspiration, some grand revelation about your voice, your vision, your calling, or maybe, or just mostly, what you need is someone who has already walked the path and someone who is there to tell you, I got burned too. Here is how you keep moving, even after you've been burned in the fire. And I thought this show, the podcast, would be about creating space for artists of color to tell their stories. But you know what? It's kind of been a little bit different. It's really been about assembling these lifelong lessons, and it's been a gift each episode after another, because essentially with each episode I learn something else about myself that I didn't know. And I learned that my guests have become the stoic philosophers I didn't know I needed. Not necessarily because they quoted ancient texts, but because they've lived through so many more of the modern equivalents of the things that I've survived or that I've tried to survive, and they've survived these things as well, and they have a map to show me the other places that I will go and where I will fall, and they tell me what to avoid. So this brings me back to episode 36, when I was doing everything in the podcast myself. I was editing the podcast at midnight. I was writing all of the show notes during my lunch break. I was answering emails. I was pitching sponsors. I was managing social media. I was trying to prove to myself and to others that the podcast sounded a lot more polished than I could make it, right? I was just really one person. I was a one person operation that needed five people. And I didn't have the money. I didn't know how to ask for help, honestly. Then Farisa Knox comes on the podcast. So she comes on and she says something that's so simple that I almost missed it. She said, hire for each type of work you do. So marketing, sales, admin. Don't go around thinking you're going to find help. You're going to get an assistant. And so they're just going to replace you. That's not how it works. Farisa is so right. And I think about that all the time. Each time I come to a roadblock, hire for the specific work roles that you do in as a freelancer. And yeah, I could have read that in a business book, right? Maybe some chapter on scaling, some framework for growth. But hearing it from Farisa, who'd built her own thing from scratch, who knew what it was like to spend money on getting help to build your business. Wow, that was different. And it wasn't really theory because she had been through, right? She had that map and she'd drawn it by getting lost first and by taking wrong turns, I should say, and expensive detours and finally finding the way. And so she was sharing that portion of the map with me. So fast forward to years later, where I was able to work with both Lena and Daniel, who helped me with producing the podcast as well as with doing all of the social media and assets and things like that with it. It feels so much better, I swear. Like the time I used to spend reading and researching all of the guests as well as prepping for each episode and then writing social media copy. Oh my gosh. And they do all of that for me. And I am so, so grateful. And but that's the thing about lived knowledge. It really carries the weight, and it carries weight that advice never really does. You can read 100 articles about delegation, or you can hear someone who's been there and who's been exactly where you were, and they say, this is what I did and it worked. And somehow that shifts something in you. If you haven't read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, it really is great, because someone who lived thousands of years ago, or it's having kind of the same issues that we're having today. It's so relevant even to today. So, I mean, he faced things like senators who plotted to against him, or the Tiber River flooding, and yet another frontier war demanding his attention. And he talked about like, what's up to me? What do I actually have control over? And the answer is, in my case at least, hire someone who is hire someone or barter with someone to help with the thing that is actually really stopping you in your tracks, that thing that's stopping you from um getting farther along. And I have to say, like, I have a business that helps to pay for this, my creative work. I take creative work that I normally wouldn't take on to be able to pay for having Daniel as well as for Lena helping me. And it's made such a world of difference and has allowed me to focus on other ways of actually making money, funny enough, because the podcast takes hours of work. Now, then there was the question I didn't know I needed to ask. How do you actually build community when you're starting from not much? Ooh, I didn't know that's a lesson I was going to learn from the podcast, but this one came in waves and it was real lesson, right? Lessons like this didn't come all at once, but they came slowly. So it came with Nolis Anderson, who was in episode 3. And I was figuring this out even more slowly, how to build an audience. And then came episode 93 with Mulaney Barnett, who showed me, and she had found this rhythm, and she had built Badge, where she was able to create a community of artists and creators to come together and to support each other. There was also episode 181 with Sage East, and through them, through Sage, through Mulaney, through Nolis, I really came to understand how to think about building community. And this season, you might have heard some other people, and I've been asking people this question because I'm thinking about how to build this community better. But what stuck with me was how their answers really converged, right? Sage talked about showing up to events and not really not to network, but to learn, to ask questions, to be genuinely curious about someone else's work instead of just mentally rehearsing your pitch. Nolis talked about making introductions between people who should know each other better. He talked about reaching out really easily through Instagram, through DMs, and Mulaney talked about the long game. She talked about how relationships are built over years and how that she really focuses on that and how they then become the foundation for everything. She also talked about how investment property is the way to go to ensure your retirement. But that's another conversation for another time. So I'd been treating community like a transaction. Actually, I don't think I've ever treated community like a transaction. I've always thought about it as a way to give something. But what I did wrong was to be consistent, right? But all of the guests showed me that there was something else entirely, that community was a garden that you plant seeds knowing that they will bloom. You you water the things that you want to grow for years, and you show up even when it's like you feel like nothing is happening. And and sometimes, if you're patient, if you're genuine, if you stop trying to extract value from every interaction, something else takes root. Something you didn't even know that was growing suddenly blooms. Epictetus knew this too. He taught that relationships weren't just about external controls, but the outcomes weren't up to you. What was up to you was to show up with intention, with generosity, and the rest was to be revealed, right? And with nearly 200 episodes under my belt, the questions that feel uniquely mine that I used to ask myself, am I good enough? How do I make this podcast sustainable? Does my voice really matter? These questions, then, they're not really unique at all. They are not unique because humans 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, they were all saying all of this. They were thinking all of these. And even now with Massimo, if you I think back about Massimo sitting on the highway, he too was feeling this. The comfort is that that struggle goes away. I think that you're not the first person to face it. You're not the last person. And if Marcus Aurelius could apply stoicism to his life while running an empire, a plague, maybe I could too. Maybe you can apply the wisdom, the guests that have been on the podcast to the very small corner of your world. Wisdom isn't handed from on high. It's passed down from person to person. You adjust it for your own circumstances. You add it to your life when life tests you, and you sit with it long enough to hear their success stories, to hear other people's stories, and to think about your own success stories. Thank you so much for joining me here on This Is How We Create. I would love to hear who has been your favorite guest and what wisdom have you learned from that guest? That's it. Thank you so much. Stay creative, my friends.
Hi there. If you're loving this show, would you mind taking a quick second to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite go-to podcast app? While you're at it, subscribe to our Substack newsletter, Creative Matters. You can find the link to subscribe in the show notes. All right, that's all that I have for you today. Bye.